Welcome to the 16th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through how to add, update, and remove users on your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance using Tableau Server Client. To add a user to your Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance, you will need to create a user object or item. When creating the user object, you will need to specify the name or email address and site role. To update an existing user, you simply need to specify the user object and corresponding attributes or properties you would like to update. And finally, to remove a user, simply provide the locally unique identifier value associated with the user. In most instances, you will not have memorized a user's locally unique identifier value, so I recommend first fetching the user object using the user's endpoint to get the necessary value. To showcase each type of request, let us jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin developing a script that adds a new user to my Tableau Cloud instance, updates the same user's site role, and finally removes that user. All right, to get started, I'll go ahead and create my Tableau authentication object. This object is going to be responsible for allowing me to authenticate and sign into my server. I require 3 pieces of information: the token name, the token value, and the site ID. All of those are here currently, so I have TSM as my token name. My token value is being stored and retrieved using keyrings, so I don't expose that during this tutorial. My site ID is SQL short reads. I'll be connecting to my cloud instance. Let's go ahead and run this to create that object. The next step is I'm going to add a user to my Tableau Cloud instance. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to say new user is equal to tsc.user_item. So I'm going to create the user item or object that's configured with the details that are necessary for this new user. So let's go ahead and say name is equal to SQL short reads at gmail.com. So if you're on cloud, the name value will actually be an email address. If you're on server, the name could be a variety of things. It could be the user ID, it could be the name of the person. All right, let's go site role is equal to unlicensed. So I'm going to add this user as an unlicensed user on my server for now, because what we're going to do is we're going to update this user site role later on in this tutorial. And then for Tableau Cloud, you'll need an authentication setting. And that authentication setting is going to be Tableau ID with MFA. So basically what's going to happen here is whenever I add this user to my server, the server is going to shoot off an email to here, so one of my personal email addresses, and it's going to ask me to either create a user or authenticate, right, for the first time. Okay, so we have our new user, and let me just go ahead and document this. So we're going to configure new user. And then what are we going to do here? So what we need is we need to use the user's endpoint to add the user. So the user's endpoint has an add method. To do that, what we'll do is we'll do a try block here. We'll do a try except else block here. So I'm going to say try server.users.add, and I'm going to add that user item. So I'm going to use this keyword argument user item is equal to new user. I'm going to pass that in. So if there's any exception raised, any exception raised at all will prevent this user from being added to the server. So I'm just going to use a bare except here. You can further flesh this out if you'd like, but for the sake of this tutorial, we'll use a bare except. I'm going to say print, and I'm going to say unable to add new user.name. So I'm going to extract the name attribute from this user object and make that available in the output. And if all goes well, I'm going to say print, I'm going to say new user.name, and I'm going to say successfully updated. So let's just say successfully added, actually. That's more correct. Okay, so what we have here again is we have a try except else block that's going to attempt to use the add method at the user's endpoint to add this newly configured user here. If that doesn't work out, we're going to see a feedback loop here that basically says, hey, we were unable to add this user. And then that's going to give you some direction on, hey, what went wrong? Try to find out what went wrong. Otherwise, we're going to see this print message that says the user was successfully added to our server, in this case, a cloud instance. So let's go ahead and run this. And what I want to do before I run this, actually, let me go to my server. Let's go to my server and look at the users that are currently on there. So let's go ahead and refresh this. We have 2 users, so they're both me. Both personal email addresses, so we have 2 users. And what we're going to see here is the result of running this script. We're going to see a 3rd user added. The user will be SQL short reads at gmail.com. The site role will be unlicensed, and the authentication site will be Tableau ID with MFA. Okay, so let's go ahead and run it. All right, so we see SQL short reads at gmail.com successfully added. Let's go back to my server and refresh this page. Okay, so we see here we successfully added the user. The user is unlicensed, and the authentication setting is Tableau with MFA. The next step in this tutorial that I want to take is I want to actually update this user's license or site role to be licensed as opposed to unlicensed. This will allow the user to be able to view the content if they have the relevant permissions. Let's go ahead and go back to Visual Studio. And let's go down to our next block. So whenever we're updating a user's properties, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to first fetch that object because we need the user's locally unique identifier to update the user object that's maintained on your server or your cloud instance. And most people are not going to have a spreadsheet on their local machine or saved somewhere that has a list of every user's locally unique identifier. And also, you're not going to memorize these. So we will first fetch that user object. And to do that, we'll create a filtering request. So I'm going to say, create a user filter for the update request. And to do that, we'll use a request options object. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you'll notice that I use this quite often as a means to fetch a particular object from my server as opposed to fetching all of those. Like for example, I want to update a single user here, not all of my users. If I wanted to update all the users, I could just fetch every single user without filtering. So let's recreate a request options object and let's add a filter to that. And what type of filter do we want? We want to filter on the name of the user. So we'll say TSC request options .field .name. So that's the field that we're going to be filtering on. And how are we going to be filtering? We're going to be using a equals operator. And what is the value we're looking for? Well, we're looking for SQL short reads at gmail.com. That is the user we just added. And that's going to be our filtering request. So let's go ahead and try this out real quick. So let's go ahead and let's go user is equal to server.users.get request options. And let's see what we have here. Just print this user. Okay, what did I do wrong here? So we have a tuple, has no underscore dict. So we need to do user. And let's look at this object. So we have a tuple, and in the first position of that tuple is a list. It's going to be the list of users retrieved. That is a single user because our filtering request is for a single user. And we can see the attributes associated with that user. So the name, SQL short reads as expected. The role is unlicensed. The authentication is Tableau ID with MFA. Now, so we're showing here that the filtering request worked appropriately. The next step we want to do is we actually want to use the update method at the user's endpoint to update this user's license, this user's site role. Sorry, and we're going to update that to viewer. So let's go ahead and make a few updates here. And what we'll say here is just to comment exactly what we're doing here. Retrieve the specific user object requiring updates if it exists. And what we'll do is say try. So we're going to use the same idea as previously, but in this case, we're going to do this. Let's do if, and if we're going to say if server.users.get, we're going to use this Pythonic way of checking if a list is empty or not. So this is, again, this returns a tuple, right? As we see here. So this returns a tuple, and we're going to check the first index in that tuple. And that index is actually a list object, right? So we're going to check if this is empty or not. And if it isn't, then we're going to say user equals server.users.get. So we're going to make a get request, and we're going to use those same request options. And we're going to access the actual user object in this tuple. So the user is going to be this object here. So we're accessing the first object in the tuple, or the first index in the tuple. And that is going to be a list of user objects. And in that list is only a single user, so we're going to access the first index. Essentially, that is the user we want to actually update, right? So I'm going to say user is equal to that. And then I'm going to update the user's site role to reflect viewer. And this is going to be a capital V. That makes a big difference here. It will fail if you do not use a capital V in viewer. So I'm going to say user.site role. I'm going to update this attribute. So the user has a site role attribute, as you see here, unlicensed. And I'm going to set that to viewer. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use that try except else block. I'm going to say try server.users.update. And I'm going to say user item is equal to user. So again, this is super important, right? If we didn't know which user, so the details of the user we want to update, we wouldn't be able to pass in. We need to have memorized a locally unique identifier, or have some other mechanism to actually pass in the actual user object. So I'm going to try and say server users.update, update that user that has the newly reflected viewer role, and do another var accept. And if it doesn't work, we're going to say unable to update user.name. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to copy and paste some of this stuff and update the messaging. Unable to update. And user was successfully updated. So let's go ahead and try this, and then we'll check on my Tableau server or my Tableau Cloud instance if this user's site role has been updated. Okay, so it says it's been successfully updated, so that means that we were able to update the user's site role to viewer. But to double check that that's actually occurred, let's go back to my Tableau Cloud instance, and we're going to refresh this and see if that site role has been updated. And it has. This user has now been upgraded to a site role of viewer, so they should be able to access workbooks, data sources, subscriptions, things like that, as long as they have the relevant permissions to do so. Okay, let's jump back over to Visual Studio Code and perform the final step in this script or this tutorial, and that's going to be to remove this same user. So typically you're not going to add a user, update it, and then remove it. This tutorial is just focused on you being able to understand how do I add, update, and remove users. Not necessarily adding, updating, and removing them in that sequence, right? Because it would make no sense to add a user just to update it, just to ultimately remove it. What is more likely to be the case in real world scenario is you're going to add a list of users. So you may use pandas, you may take an Excel file that has a list of users. So say email addresses or a list of user IDs, and you read that into the script, and then you come up here and you iterate over those user items in that Excel file, and you add them one by one. Same thing with the updates, right? So you could iterate over an Excel file and update them one by one with various options or updates to their attributes. Same thing with removing. You could remove, you could do a bulk removal request. You could remove thousands of users in one go, hundreds of users in one go. That's kind of the idea, but here we're just trying to get comfortable with adding, updating, and removing users from your Tableau server or Tableau Cloud instance. So let's go ahead and remove a user. And we're going to do the same thing. So when we want to remove a user, we have to know which user that is, right? So I need to fetch that user object. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the same user we just added and subsequently updated. It's going to be that user. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and copy and paste some more of this. So I'm going to say, check to see if the user exists, requiring removal. So we want to check if it actually returns a user object. So if this GET request is empty, so if the list returned by this GET request is empty, then we're going to say that the user's not found. All right, let's keep on going. So we have the user, so we've basically saying if the user exists, say that's our user, grab the user object. And the next step we're going to do is we're going to use a similar strategy here. I'm just going to copy and paste it and update it here. We're going to say remove. And what we need here to remove a user is still the user item. And what I'm going to do here is I need actually not just the user item, I just need the user ID. So again, one of the reasons you're wanting to fetch this object first is because you're not going to memorize this user ID, right? So I'm going to say user ID is equal to user.id. So this is the ID attributes of the user that we fetched, right? So of this user object, which is going to be the locally unique identifier of this user, sqlshortreads@gmail.com. All right, so I'm then able to remove, successfully removed, and we'll say from the server. Okay, so let's go ahead and try to run this. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to finish this else block here. I'm going to say else. Print user not found, right? So again, if our GET request comes back with an empty list of users fetched, that means the user was not found. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. All right, and we got a success message saying that the user has been removed from the server. Let's go ahead and double check that by going back to my Tableau Cloud instance. And you'll see that the user is here. And I'm going to refresh, and we're going to see that this user's been removed. And voila, it's gone. So that user's been successfully removed from our server. Let's jump back over to Visual Studio Code and just reiterate what we've done here. So in the beginning here, we used the REST API's add method from the user's endpoint to add a user after configuring the user. We then updated that same user by using the update method of the user endpoint, and we updated that user's site role from unlicensed to viewer. And finally, we've used the same mechanisms of a filtering request to fetch that user, to get the user ID attributes, so that we can pass that in to the remove method at the user's endpoint to ultimately remove the user from the server. As a final note, I do want to mention that these scripts can be found in a nearly ready-to-go form on my GitHub. I'll go ahead and showcase that now. So here on my GitHub, there is a folder called Tableau Server Client, a subfolder called Adding, Updating, and Removing Objects, and then finally a subfolder called Users. Within this folder, you're going to find the 3 scripts that we walked through today, so Add User, Update User, and Remove User. These are all in a nearly ready-to-go form in the sense that you just need to update the credentials, so your token name, the token value, and the site ID, so everything that has to deal with the authentication object, the server, and then any type of updates you want to make here. So your request options filter is going to be different, your error handling may be different, but either way, each of these scripts will give you a head start. Okay, so that wraps up this video on modifying users programmatically through Tableau Server Client. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud instance through automation. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.